Star Trek The Next Generation Season 3 was a strong outing for the franchise, but no one at the time could have predicted the impact that the Best of Both Worlds two-parter would have on Star Trek as a whole. And today we are taking a look at Star Trek's best episode of all time and learn the behind-the-scenes information that would make fandom lose its mind over the summer of 1990. Hello and welcome to Backtrek, a web series that focuses on the background information on any given topic in Star Trek. In this episode, we're taking a look at Star Trek The Next Generation's episode The Best of Both Worlds Part 1, to better understand its place in Star Trek history. Please note, this episode of Backtrek is about The Best of Both Worlds Part 1, and really Part 1 alone. And although a two-parter, in referencing this episode, I will most likely merely be calling it The Best of Both Worlds, as constantly referring to it as Part 1 just ruins the flow of this video. Anyhow, with all that out of the way, let's begin. Doing my general overview of Star Trek's history videos, I have to be honest, I was unprepared for two things. First, being how popular these videos would end up being, and the second, how many people were just waiting for me to get to TNG's Season 3 and this episode. Constantly, I got messages and comments wondering when it would happen, and demanding that before I head into TNG's 4th season, that I had to cover The Best of Both Worlds. And so, here we are. The Borg themselves had been introduced in Season 2 of The Next Generation, one of the only real great contributions made by the now ousted Maurice Hurley. As an enemy, the Borg held great potential, especially after the Ferengi, a Gene Roddenberry creation that was supposed to be the big baddies of the series, had utterly failed to be realized. And although they did have great potential, the writers still had a problem with them, that being how difficult it is to write for beings with absolutely no personality. To do this, and to do this right, they would need a writer with a great talent to really bring them to life, while simultaneously creating a story involving our heroes that would make sense and flow effortlessly. And that man to achieve this successful outcome would be Michael Piller. Piller would end up having a long and fruitful career with Star Trek until his death in 2005. He had been hired by his longtime friend Maurice Hurley in Season 2 of the series to work on a few scripts Hurley needed completed really fast. And this in turn would lead to a one-year contract for Season 3, which then in turn would lead to Piller becoming an executive producer on the series. He would then end up helping to create both Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager, as well as co-writing and co-producing Star Trek Insurrection. To bring The Best of Both Worlds to life, Piller from the get-go had started with the idea of a Season 3 cliffhanger, feeling the season had been strong in its execution, while also realizing that a cliffhanger would allow for two things. First, if done right, it would ensure TNG had a strong return for Season 4. And second, depending on the story he crafted, any number of changes could be made to the show itself to correct any remaining problems created by the first two seasons of the series. Every TNG writer, however, had an idea of how the story should be and how it should unfold. But one universal idea from the writer's room was to create a Borg queen. Piller, however, was dead set against this idea. He says, "To me, there was something special and frightening about the Borg that their lack of character brought to the table. For a show that dwells and specializes in character, to be challenged and possibly destroyed by a characterless villain seemed to me to be a kind of special threat." But when we started talking about the cliffhanger and the Borg, we really did talk about who was going to be the Queen Bee, and I was dead set against it. It was then that I came up with the notion of having Picard be assimilated by the Borg, and then suddenly it all just fell into place. I said, "I've got it, Picard will be the Queen Bee." A little bit of Trek trivia for you all here. As story ideas were being kicked around for the cliffhanger, again many writers had their own takes on how the episode should unfold. As a result, in the early drafts of the story, Picard and Data were to have been combined as the Borg Queen. Thankfully, though, after careful consideration and asking the simple question, why should we do this, Piller decided to remove this idea from the story completely. Piller always felt that the heart of Star Trek was in its characters, rather than the future technology everyone was using. And so he also very early on decided to challenge Commander Riker, asking and then answering the question of if the good commander was really up to the challenge of assuming command. Piller states, "I had no idea this would become a Riker story when we started out. I came up with the idea of having the Shelby character come on board to challenge Riker. That seemed to play into Riker's emotions and conflicts over whether or not to take a job. And that builds into the issue of whether or not he was big enough to fill that center chair." This wasn't the only reason Piller had created the Shelby character, as Piller himself wanted to explore why Riker would stay on the Enterprise as a first officer rather than taking the first command he was offered, as so many of us would have. Also, Piller himself had to make a similar choice. With his contract being up at the end of the season, he had to decide whether or not to stay for another year or to leave for greener pastures. He recalls, "By the end of the season, I was struggling with whether or not to stay or leave, and this came out in the screenplay for The Best of Both Worlds Part 1, as Riker spoke about those exact same issues I was having. It was very much an art imitating life situation. One scene in particular, Riker talking to Troy about why he hasn't left, that was really me speaking through Riker." Piller's decision to stay with Star Trek, however, would not come from Piller's writing struggles into the script. Rather, it would come thanks to Gene Roddenberry himself. A common misconception amongst most of fandom is that Gene left the series before Season 3 even began, but this isn't true at all. Gene's true departure from Star Trek would only happen after his death in 1991. He continued to be involved with TNG, though due to his continual deterioration of his health, his involvement would grow less and less, a slow departure from the series over time rather than an instantaneous one. While researching all these behind-the-scenes videos, I've been pretty hard on Gene Roddenberry, as his actions, generally speaking, were horrible and deserved to be called out for what they were regardless of how I felt personally. But by the end of Season 3, it seems to me that Gene knew he wouldn't be around for much longer, and reacted to this by ensuring that Star Trek would. Instead of exerting his force to make TNG the Trek it was in Season 1, he instead began to consciously pull back, allowing Rick Berman to make many of the decisions that would lead the next generation to become a fan favorite. One thing that was clear to the production team of TNG was how Piller had contributed so much to the success of Season 3. And so Roddenberry himself would have a meeting with Piller and would convince the writer to stay on, solidifying Trek's success for the future. The Best of Both Worlds Part 1 was an amazing episode, not only because of the great story, but every other aspect of the episode as well. The Borg costumes themselves were based on ones from Season 2's episode Q Who, which were created by Dorinda Rice Wood. However, Robert Blackman, who had taken over for Wood, would improve upon the design, both in look and wearability, while simultaneously staying very true to Wood's original design. Locutus's costume in particular would be an amazing triumph. By utilizing a small laser worth a couple of dollars, Locutus would come to life and be one of the most menacing sights ever seen in Star Trek. Michael Westmore's son, Michael, who was in charge of creating all the electronics in Locutus's headpiece, would come up with this brilliant idea, and no one can deny its effectiveness on screen. The interior of the Borg cube was also quite effective in this episode. By adding lights under the stage to shine up through the gratings, it really added an extreme horror feeling to the entire set. Another little bit of Trek trivia for you all comes from the subspace communications with Admiral Hansen. These scenes were filmed in two ways. The first was the standard crew looking at an empty monitor with actors listening and responding to someone reading the dialogue off screen, and the Admiral being added in at a later time in post-production. The second, more unusual way this was done, though, was with the Admiral's filmed sequences actually playing on the screen while the actors watched. And so, if you look closely, you can tell which scenes use this second technique, as the conference table itself shows Hansen's reflection in it, while the scenes done in the original usual first way do not. George Murdoch, who played Admiral Hansen in this episode, was no stranger to Star Trek. In Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, he actually played God himself, and he had an extensive acting career, appearing or guest starring in over 200 movies and television shows. Murdoch died on April 30th, 2012 of cancer at the age of 81. Cliff Boyle would direct this episode, Boyle being the person who the Bolian species was actually named after. Cliff directed 25 episodes of TNG, 7 episodes of Deep Space Nine, and 10 episodes of Voyager. Several new exterior visual shots had to be created for this episode, including the Enterprise D entering the Pulsar Nebula. To achieve these shots, the Mutara Nebula stock footage was reused but enhanced to make it appear brighter and slightly different, while the Enterprise herself was filmed on a stage that was filled with smoke, helping to create an entirely different nebula than that seen in Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. I'd be remiss here if I also didn't mention the amazing musical score created by Ron Jones. The orchestra used for this episode would be double in size than that normally used, and the music serves to heighten the episode in so many ways. Its importance and elegance can never be overstated. A last little bit of Trek trivia for you all here is in relation to the name of the Borgified Picard, which of course was Locutus. Locutus's function, after all, in the episode was to speak for the Borg, and so Locutus, which is Latin for he who has spoken, seems rather fitting. The Best of Both Worlds would be a monumental event in Star Trek history. Most newer fans of Star Trek don't really understand its importance, though they do agree on how wonderful the episode actually is. This episode marked a clear change in direction for the series, while it also kept fandom on its seat for an entire summer wondering what the outcome of this episode would truly be. And the repercussions of this two-parter on Star Trek as a whole also cannot be ignored. Deep Space Nine and Voyager would explore the effects of Wolf 359 and the Borg with varying degrees of success. Even Enterprise would contain its own Borg episode. Star Trek: The Next Generation would also capitalize on Picard's assimilation, having episodes like I, Borg exploring the mental effect on Picard from this encounter, while episodes such as The Drumhead would throw a mention of the Battle of Wolf 359 to strengthen its own storyline. And finally, even a feature film would be based on these kooky cybernetic lifeforms, that film being hailed by most of fandom as the best of the Next Generation films. Star Trek Picard Season 1 would use the Borg to show the lasting effect assimilation had, not only on Jean-Luc Picard, but Annika Hansen as well, Voyager 7 of 9. Yet this episode, if it had not been done right, could have spelled the end of that particular Trek thread of storytelling. Luckily for us, however, Michael Piller and the entire production team of Star Trek: The Next Generation was able to pull off a miracle. An episode where all the pieces seamlessly fit together to create an enduring legacy for the franchise that still holds strong even to this day.
They're the most powerful force in the universe. Now the Borg have the most destructive plan ever to conquer the human race.
You have committed acts of aggression against the United Federation of Planets.
Target 1, the Enterprise.
Directed, Det 9.
Geordi, evacuate engineering.
Target 2, Captain Picard.
Your culture will adapt to service ours.
We would rather die.
The final target,
Earth.
on the next exciting episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Backtrek. What did you think of The Best of Both Worlds Part 1? Were you on the edge of your seat for the summer of 1990, wondering what would happen to the series? Well, leave your comments in the section below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel, hitting that little bell icon so you won't miss a single video we release. Want to help the channel engage the Borg? Then consider becoming a channel patron. The link to our Patreon account is in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and remember, resistance is futile.